morning to all of you on the West Coast and good afternoon to everybody everywhere else. On behalf of Summit Leadership Partners, welcome to Transforming Tech, 5 Traits of Highly Successful Leaders. My name is Rob Greenhalgh. I'll be your facilitator today, and I'm a member of the Summit team. For those of you who are joining us and meeting us for the first time, Summit is a leadership advisory firm. We work with investors, boards, CEOs, and their leadership teams to accelerate business performance. Our goal as a firm is to provide our clients with the strategic insights and practical solutions that both leaders and organizations need to scale for growth. And as you can see on the slide here, we work in a number of different areas, everything from organizational assessment to executive and team coaching and to leadership assessments. For those of us that partner with our private equity clients, we also work in terms of due diligence support. So thank you for joining us today. Enough about Summit, and let's introduce our panelists. They're going to have a chance to introduce themselves in a few minutes, but let's at least run through who's joining us for the conversation we're going to have. First, we have Nishant Patel, founder and CTO of Content Stack. We're joined by Jason Ewell, operating partner at Insight Partners. Our very own Corinne Mason, partner here at Summit Leadership Partners. John Vium, senior vice president at Renaissance. And Steve Kondred, chief technology officer at Trinetics. I think we're in for a great conversation today. We're looking forward to hearing from all of you. So why don't I hand it over to Nishant for a more formal introduction.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me here. My name is Nishant Patel. I am co-founder and CTO at Content Stack. And Content Stack is a company that provides global brands the ability to manage and deliver content to various channels like web, mobile, digital signage, etc. And prior to Content Stack, I've been in sort of the tech space for 25 years or so now. Prior to that, I was a CEO at a company called Built.io, which pioneered integration technology on the cloud, basically helping people connect their cloud integration, cloud applications. And then prior to that, I ran a services company, serving customers across the globe, implementing a lot of cloud solutions. So that's my quick sort of background. Thank you.
Thanks, Nishant. We're excited to leverage and hear about all those experiences as we talk about today's topic, so thank you. Next, let's hand it over to Jason from Insight Partners.
I'm Jason Ewell from Insight Partners. I'm an operating partner here at Insight. That means I spend all of my time working with the portfolio companies that we've invested in, helping them be successful in their pursuits. 85% of my time is spent actually working on talent, and most of that on actually hiring both executives and individual contributors. We have over 11,000 open jobs in the portfolio right now, so there's a lot of volume. And then I sit on a couple of boards. I've always sat on 1 or 2 boards during my time here. Prior to that, I was at a vertical software SaaS firm serving the hotel industry called TravelClick. It was owned by Genstar. We sold to Tomo Bravo, and I ran all 4 of the businesses ultimately by the time I left there. And then before that, I spent the large majority of my career at American Express. Almost everything I learned about leadership and talent I learned there, and I've just been applying it since. It was a great place to learn about leadership.
Great, Jason. Yeah, we're looking forward to hearing your perspective, especially from the PE perspective. So thanks for joining us. I hand it over now to our own Corinne Mason.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone. I have the pleasure of being here among all of these esteemed people. Rob and I'm in Austin, Texas. Rob's in San Francisco, California. So he and I do a lot of work with technology firms and companies, and specifically with C-suite players. But some of my favorite are always the CTOs, CIOs, because I think their role is evolving. So we'll talk about that some more today. But some of the folks on here have been some of our favorite clients, and that's part of the reason we invited them today. So we're looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thanks, Corinne. Speaking of favorite clients, John Vium and I partner very closely. And so let's hand it over to you and hear a little about you, John.
All right, Rob, you're one of my favorites too. As Rob said, my name is John Vium, and I'm Senior Vice President of Engineering at Renaissance Learning. And Renaissance is a software development company whose mission is to accelerate learning for all. And we do that by creating reading and math practice applications, assessment solutions for the K-12 market. We're a worldwide company, have a unique history. We started actually back in 1986 in the basement of our founder's home in a small town in central Wisconsin, and not exactly the tech hub of the world, but we've grown to be really one of the leaders in the ed tech market. We grew, from a very small startup to, going public, and then really the last 10 years we've been owned by, various private equity firms. Personally, I've been in technology for the past 35 years. The last 22 with Renaissance. I started my career as a software engineer building in-house applications for a large utility and then a large paper company before moving on to Renaissance. And I've spent really the last, my full career at Renaissance in various leadership roles, from a team lead to now, senior vice president. I've got a budget of about 35 million that I manage, and 150 people in my organization. So really excited to be here today to share my experiences and what I've gone through, and hopefully share with you some good tips on leadership. So thanks.
Thanks, Sean. And speaking of Wisconsin Rapids, I think now that we're starting to travel a little bit more post-COVID, I think I'll be making a trip out to Wisconsin Rapids. So looking forward to the introduction there.
Awesome.
Awesome. All right. And last but not least, Steve.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure to be here. Really honored to be surrounded by some amazing panelists. I'm Steve Kondred. I'm the CTO of Trinetics. We're on a mission to build a data and analytics ecosystem across the globe to bring healthcare data to bear to solve real human health challenges. What does that mean in practice? We're helping pharmaceutical companies better design their clinical trials, better place those trials globally at sites where patients need that research opportunity as perhaps the last line of defense to disease. We've been in operation for just about 7 years. I joined the company very early on, have enjoyed the growth here. I lead up the engineering team from a global perspective. And before Trinetics, I spent 10 years at a clinical research organization focused on using medical images to do very similar things. We're using medical imaging and the data it produces to bring new drugs to market and get approval from FDA, EMA, et cetera. In my spare time, I love to fly fish, and we were just joking about that before the panel started. So pleasure to be here, and back to you, Rob.
Well, thanks, Steve. And I do some work with Trinetics as well, and so it's great to have you on the panel and hear a little bit more of your perspective. So let's jump into it then. Let's get going. The first question is to John, not to play favorites at all, but to John. I know in the work we've done together, one of the things you mentioned quite a bit is ownership mentality. Tell us a little bit about your experience at Renaissance that has given you a greater appreciation around developing ownership mentality.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And it is a focus for Renaissance, this idea of ownership mentality. And it can be, right, when people think about ownership and that mentality, what does it mean? You can unpack it a lot of different ways. But for us, there's really two dimensions that we think about at Renaissance around this ownership mentality. And one is kind of personal, if you will, or at a team level, where we hope and we strive and we're really trying to build a culture of empowerment so that people really take accountability for what they're doing, for the quality and for the success of their work, both at an individual level and a team level. In many cases, we're a very distributed organization. There's times where it's easy to get bogged down by, geez, somebody is blocking me. And what we're trying to do is build that mindset of, no, you own your work and you have to do whatever you need to do to get that work done, and take a full stake in the success of that, and build, like I said, a culture where it's okay to take risks as well, to learn and grow from those risks. And if the outcome of some of those don't go quite the way we want, it's okay, right? It's an opportunity to learn and to grow. And we've even to the point taken this where we've baked this really into our career ladders. So it's a skill or a responsibility or, a trait, if you will, that we expect all of our employees and especially our leaders to have as they kind of progress in their career. So that's one dimension. The other dimension that I learned kind of later, in my career, and really when I jumped into Renaissance, was taking, really that view as I'm an owner of the company. So it's a much broader picture and much broader understanding of how my job impacts the entire organization. And I learned that pretty quick at Renaissance, right? I was in a large utility and a large paper company. I came to Renaissance, a smaller org, and this was when we had just gone public, a few years, a year or so after we'd gone public, and the CEO and the finance people were very concerned about, hitting our forecasts and market analysts, predictions. And I started in April, so it was the end of, Q3. So in September, the CEO came to my office at the end of Q3, the last day, and he said, "Hey, John, I need you to stay late. We need to ship some orders. We've been watching the order total today, and we're a little late." And I thought, what the hell is he asking me to do this? Right? I'm a new kid on the block, but I think the thought was, hey, my team support these applications, right? That I should know, how to ship, and this again, 1999, we were shipping product actually to customers, which we really don't do anymore. So it was myself, my boss, a finance manager, the customer support person, and thank God we had the shipping manager with us as well. But we went down and obviously it didn't go so well right from the start. But ultimately we started using the system, printing out orders, scanning orders, printing manifests, packaging, all of this stuff up, these orders up and sending them off. And that whole experience made me stop and realize that I'm now have to think differently. I'm in a company, I'm in an org where I need to think about being an owner of this company, which means when I build software, I need to think of, how do we market it? How do we sell it? How are the support people going to answer questions that customers may have? And, during that process, I learned a lot, like, geez, we need to update the system a little bit. It wasn't working quite the way, we expected it to, but it gets into so many bigger and more broad things, even from, our DEI initiatives or hiring, right? Because many times when you're thinking and your mentality is all around what you do and not looking globally, you may want to hire people because you feel like you're short resources, but the company may have a bigger vision on, geez, we need to really control costs, right? Maybe we're in that cycle with a PE firm, right, where we're looking to maybe, start hitting the due diligence trail, and we need to really show how, the financials are looking. So this mentality of ownership, like I said, we've really, it's something me and my staff talk about every week. Of building that mentality, looking more broadly across the organization, and even at the point where can we share resources? Is there an opportunity for some leader in our org that's really a high performer that, would do really well by moving to another area of the company and broadening their skills, broadening their understanding of the organization. And so it's just some of those things, Rob, that we've talked about. And like I said, we've built into our development, career ladders to make sure that it's a focus for us, for sure. And these relationships I've made by doing that, right? Because to me, as you grow in your career, you need relationships, right? You can't do it alone. And this mentality has helped me form lasting relationships that these people in other parts of the org have really become partners of mine to help me be successful and me to help them be successful.
Great. So quick question, John. I'm curious around how kind of broadly across Renaissance there is this concept of ownership mentality. I think you might even have a value around it. And, maybe within your team first, and then even more broadly in the organization, have you seen a shift in the culture at all when people start embracing this idea of ownership mentality?
Yeah, we have started. I think, this mindset has started a bit more in engineering. A lot of this is come from teams and owning various components or services around our tech stack and knowing that, hey, you own this from beginning to production as well. But that mindset has allowed us, and especially my leaders, to reach out to other parts of the org. And what it's caused, I think, is a lot more collaboration, right? We broke down silos because we're all in this together. If we're building a new feature, right, we're talking early to the marketing staff on and how can they potentially market this. Sales gets involved to maybe provide feedback on customers aren't asking really quite for this. Maybe if you tweak this or that, it's going to be able to sell more. Our support people, right, are deeply involved in our development processes because they need to support it. So I think what it's done for us as we've broadened this out is just broken down these silos and allowed us to work more closely together across the organization. So, we're all kind of rowing the boat in the same direction, if you will. Now, we've grown through acquisition as well. And that's where it gets a bit more tricky, right? Where we've acquired smaller companies, they've got their culture, they've done things a certain way. And so embracing the larger whole as we, acquire more companies, it's caused us to have at least those conversations, but that's a bit more tricky. But the kind of the renaissance, proper, if you will, it's really starting to break down silos for sure.
Great. I got a signal from Jason. Jason, it sounds like you have an experience that's really relevant to this.
Where John started really triggered something for me. So I walked into, when I went to TravelClick, we had a software-enabled services business, and we were selling a lot of product, and we could not fulfill on it. And what the fulfillment was actually building websites. And what you had is that the fulfillment team, the project managers, the web developers, the designers really felt like they had no one had their back, that they were being given we were selling product we couldn't fulfill on, that the sales team was getting companies to buy product, and saying, buy it now this year, you get it at the discount, but you don't have to start working on it till, third quarter next year. And they were running around chasing clients, and it was really like the tension was high. And of course the CEO was like, where's the revenue? We can't recognize the revenue till we build the product. It was just a mess. And to be fair, he told me this before I took the job. And so what we did to drive ownership, which really bothered my team, is we created goals in which they had a sales. My project managers and my developers had this business's sales goal as 10% of their rating, maybe 10. Revenue was like 15 or 20. And then how long it took the websites to be built from the time the contract was signed. And they would say, well, we should be from kickoff because, we don't control that they're not ready to work. But the reason we structured it, and that was the biggest chunk of their goal, was how fast it got delivered and the quality, the errors. And they didn't like it. And we obviously made it more to leadership. The managers and the directors really carried most of the goal. As you got down into the team, it was a little more about just the delivery. And what it caused, the behavior we wanted, was it caused them to start to put pressure on us as leaders and on the sales senior leadership to correct the problems that were happening in sales with sites being promised they weren't able to deliver. And they started applying pressure back on sales. And we created an acceptance process where a sales contract had to be accepted by that team to be valid and pay commission. And so it drove the behavior you wanted. So there's ways you can structure goals to drive ownership. And so they started to realize, because we said, when we're in here fighting with each other, then it's bad for shareholders and it's bad for customers, right? Because we either aren't delivering the product or customers are unhappy. And it led to the evolution of a lot of behavior across the organization, all through how we structured the goals and incentives. And believe me, we were not popular for doing this, but it led to the outcomes that we wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love this idea of kind of we're all in this together. And so all of our goals need to be aligned. We need to be rowing in the same direction. And to John's point earlier, I think it really breaks down silos when kind of those shared responsibilities in terms of the goals and metrics that you're going after. John, do you have anything else to say about that? Or?
Well, I was just going to double click on what Jason said about goals, right? Rob, as you know, right, we're building OKRs right into our process now, and we're trying to do, I think, exactly what Jason is talking about is align these OKRs with the business, if you will, versus just delivery of what we're doing, because that brings everybody together. So yeah, the goals is an important part of this to drive the right kind of behavior, as Jason said.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this idea of behavior is really important. One of the reasons that we decided to organize this panel today is just given the evolution of the leadership challenges people have faced over the last 15 months. And especially in the tech sector. I mean, tech has become such a central part of the discussion. I mean, Zoom fatigue is now a thing and people talk about it all the time. I know one of the things that Corinne and I work a lot in with our clients is how do you preserve and develop culture in a virtual environment? How do you drive the same kinds of behaviors that you're looking for when you're not meeting with one another? And so part of the reason we brought you guys together is to hear these experiences. We don't want to limit today's conversation to kind of the last 15 months, but I think technology has played such a central role. And then the intersection between talent, culture, and technology has become even more important. These kinds of examples, even examples drawn from 1999, I think are really relevant in terms of how do we drive the right behaviors that are at the heart of the cultures that we're trying to develop. So with that, Jason, I'll kind of continue. We'll just continue with you. You bring the PE perspective to us, and you are, dealing with leaders in tech, in the tech function, but across the enterprises that you are investing in. What do you look for in an executive leader, particularly kind of in the tech space?
We sat down and sort of deliberately thought about this when we built this group, because with the amount of scale that we're seeing, we realized we were going to have some principles to how we think about leadership. And so, what informed how we think about this are three things. One, there's a bunch of academic research out there about leadership and what makes great leaders. Two, we've filled about 400 to 500. I think actually maybe it may now be over 600 exec roles in the last 4 or 5 years at Insight. And so we're able to, and these are reporting to the CEO or the CEO themselves. So we're able to see who's performed well and why. And then we just had the collective experience of the senior leaders. We have a lot of operating partners who are in senior leadership, and we have a lot of investment partners who've seen a lot. And so we developed a set of traits or requirements for executive leadership. And I would say there are really 3 sets of characteristics we look at: skills, traits, and experience. And they matter in that order. Experience is really the least important thing in hiring. It really starts with skills and traits. And skills are really acquired skills you learn and develop in your career. And they're in 2 categories. The functional skills, like what does it take to be a great sales leader or a great engineering leader? And then what I'll call the leadership skills. So I'd like to focus on leadership skills and some of the traits that are predictive of success. And so on the leadership skill standpoint, there are certain things you need to be able to do in an executive role anywhere. It might become more important in SaaS businesses or tech businesses because of the rate of change and the velocity of change being a little bit higher, but they're still the same skills that be required to be good in any exec leadership role. So the first is what I call general management skills, but it's really diagnostic and decision-making skills. Can you go into a business? Do you have a process and an approach for diagnosing the business? Does that process and approach involve a data-based element, a customer-centric element, a human element? Do you put yourself in the customer's shoes? Do you put yourself in the employee's shoes? There's a whole comprehensive way to go about it. Is it time-bound? Is it comprehensive? Does it cover all areas? The second is then how you process that information, how quickly you make decisions, how decisive you are, how do you differentiate between urgent things that need to be decided immediately and things that are potentially company level bets that have to be thought through a little bit more. And then what's your track record in decision making? Can you explain your rationale for the choices you made and why? And so we look for that. That's one. Second is what we call being a metrics-based operator, which is that metrics can drive behavior in an organization. And you have to think of what your headline metrics are. There have to be a few of them, not a lot, and they have to be North Stars for the organization. And then how do you cascade those metrics down? So when we were doing that accountability to our team level at the, how fast it takes to build the websites, we don't get paid on how fast it takes to build the websites, but that's a lower level metric to revenue and revenue growth and revenue momentum. And utilization of the team is another thing that drives margin and cost. And so you want to talk to a leader that for their area, or if they're a CEO or CFO across the business, understands the key metrics and understands the drivers of those metrics and how they cascade down, and then can explain to you a cadence that they have and the behaviors that how they drive behavior in the organization, and how they use their cadence to do that, and how they use metrics to drive behavior. So that's a second. And then a third core skill that is a leadership skill is really all around team building and coaching. Do they have a deliberate approach to hiring? Do people follow them from place to place? Do they always fire everyone and hire only their friends? Do they always inherit everyone and can't attract any new talent? Do people follow them from place to place? Do they tap into their network? You want someone who can exhibit all those things. You don't want someone who only hires people they know, and you don't want someone who has to start from scratch every time. Can they tell you what they assess a person for? What's important to them? How do they assess? Does it make sense? I have people that say, oh, I want someone who's competitive and hardworking. And I ask them, how do you assess for that? And they say, that's a good question, and you can tell they're making it up on the spot. So to me, a person has to be able to answer those questions and demonstrate that. And then from a coaching standpoint, they have to have a philosophy of coaching, and they have to demonstrate an understanding of what it takes to motivate and coach people. And so, what commonly you see is that poor leaders either delegate or direct. They don't know how to do the in-between leadership skills, which are the much more important and harder leadership skills. I'm a big believer in situational leadership. I think it's the best coaching model out there. I think it's elegant and easy to use. So we assess for coaching skills. And so those are the main things that we evaluate for. Then from a trait standpoint, there are 2 or 3 traits that are most important: work ethic, resilience, and then we say secure in their competence. If a person is insecure, especially at our companies, we find it founder run or high growth companies, and they're afraid to ask for help when they're growing that fast, or they're afraid to be vulnerable, then they tend to have trouble succeeding.
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like you guys have a very rigorous process there on the leadership side. So, Jason, in your experience, especially on the leadership skills side, are there any of those skills that you have found are particularly challenging for? I mean, it would be great to have a leader with all of this stuff. I mean, I'm sure that you have leaders in your portfolio companies that have a good mix of all of that. But in your experience, as companies begin to scale, as leadership roles begin to scale, have you found any of them to be kind of more difficult to develop, or ones that kind of people tend to stumble on more often than not as companies and roles scale?
That's a hard question. I think you can't teach good judgment. To me, the best executives, they're great decision makers. You can, and how they tell you they make decisions should reveal, you can. So for example, I have good instincts, but I was not a data-driven decision maker early in my career. So I learned to be a better decision maker by being more disciplined and learning from those around me who are more disciplined. But it's easier to do what I did than the person who's super disciplined in all their analytics and looking at all the data, and they just have bad instincts. You can't undo bad instincts. So I think you can teach decision-making discipline. When I think about who I went to work for, it was always the best. My CEO, he was a brilliant corporate strategist and made great decisions. So I was confident working for him because I felt the company would be on the right path, and that's what I cared about. And whatever other drawbacks there might be to the opportunities to work in the particular companies or in the particular environments that I chose, I always looked at, is someone captaining the ship who I have confidence is going to get it into port, essentially. So to me, that's the hardest. You can't teach it. And people who make mediocre or poor decisions, that doesn't tend to change over time. I think the next most difficult is leadership and EQ. I don't think you can teach EQ. You can teach a lot of things about. I think it's easier to teach people how to be better leaders than it is to teach them to be better at judging. But if somebody has a bad EQ, it's really hard to overcome that. But if they have adequate EQ, you can make them a lot more effective. And I think the easiest of those 3 skills to learn is the metrics-based, management. You need a lot of people who don't have IQ and aren't very good at judgment, but they could help you run a really successful business operations team and drive a lot of positive output in the organization without them being the one making the key strategic decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else on the panel, just your own experiences in terms of some of the skills and traits that Jason talked about in terms of your ability to kind of scale, or your teams as you see your team scaling, and the things that maybe are more challenging for them, more challenging or have become even more relevant, just given kind of, the last year and a half?
I'll mention one thing just as we're going to scale. I think, Jason, you mentioned kind of leaders that are confident in themselves and their competency. I think that matters a lot as you're scaling the company, knowing where you need help, right? And to ask for that help, because it's a lot of times leaders feel like they have to know the answers to everything. And that's not, in my opinion, the right way to go about it, right? As all of us that go through this kind of scale, for me, for Content Stack, it's kind of the first time the amount of scale that we're seeing at this company. And I always have that in top of my mind. And as we're doing this thing for the first time, it's okay to go and ask for help. There's a lot leaders contribute. There's a lot of areas that you don't know, and it's okay to ask for help as well.
Yeah, I've always thought it's been a show of strength to be able to demonstrate that level of vulnerability, to say, I don't have all the answers, and then to be able to surround yourself or be able to seek out those kinds of solutions. But it is a hard thing. I mean, I've worked with clients before, and I think it is one of those leadership transitions that's challenging for folks, is to go from like subject matter expertise and kind of you're responsible for being the expert to, higher level of leadership or general management role, where it's not about having all the answers. And I found that can be a stumbling block for some folks as they're making those transitions. Awesome. Well, thanks, Jason and Nishant. I think that's really, really helpful as we continue exploring, we put 5 traits as kind of a hook. Obviously, we can see it's much more than 5, and their importance varies given context. That is one of the things that we talk a lot about at Summit, is that the leadership is also contextual, and that different forms of leadership and different skills are required depending on the situation leaders operating in. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But Corinne, so you're a seasoned executive coach, and you work with a lot of CTOs and other CXOs. And when you're working with them to discover new skills and approaches that they will need to accelerate the performance of their organizations, what would you say you've seen or heard most during this past year?
Yeah, and to your point, Rob, we don't want to contain it to just the past 12 or 18 months, but what, I found it to be so interesting. It used to be that CTO, CIOs were heads of engineering and maybe engineering and product, and that was it, right? But now every company we talk to is really a tech company in some way, shape, or form. I mean, every company, a retail, you name it. I mean, even to Summit, right? We talk about how are we going to incorporate AI into what we're doing and make ourselves more efficient. So, I think what's become phenomenal in these coaching interactions is that I'm helping these leaders understand that they are now enterprise leaders. They're no longer just engineering leaders. They are the folks who are helping organizations grow regardless of what kind of market they're in. And I just find it so much fun to watch, because I think, to Jason's point earlier, the thing I've always valued about engineers is the ability to analyze based on data and really come to good conclusions and judgment. And I think that background and basis for them elevates them to this ability to think strategically if they stretch and grow into that. And so one of the things that I've enjoyed, and maybe one of the things you do too, Rob, because you coach these folks too, is to really just help them through these pivotal points in their careers as they're growing into enterprise level leaders. Mm-hmm. And that goes back to what John was saying about having that owner's mentality. It's no longer just about owning engineering or owning product. It's about owning the whole thing. And what does that look like? And how do you drive that growth strategically with the other leaders in the organization, of course, and then also how do you help to build the platforms and the thought processes that relate to better judgment and strategic decisions as you go. It's a lot of fun to watch, and I love working with them. I consider myself a performance coach. Those who have worked with me will probably tell you that it's about the feedback. I think when we have courage to give people the feedback they need in the moment that they need it, that drives us to be better leaders. That's also part of having that owner's mentality. And then helping them with empathy and EQ work their way through what to do with that once they've heard it. And I think that's what's the value in the coaching process. So that's what I would say is I think it's no longer being a technology leader as if you run a technology organization. It is an enterprise strategic leader that is helping to embed tech in everything that all organizations are doing. And I think last year just accelerated that.
I think it's a great point. I know one of the things I talk to some of my clients about, especially as they're ascending to kind of the CXO, C-suite roles, is kind of what's your contribution to the enterprise going to be beyond kind of your functional expertise. And so you just take data, for example, or actually I'll give a concrete example of one client I'm working with who is really, really strong. I mean, he's the chief strategy officer. He was brought in, it's not a role they had before, and it's not a capability enterprise-wide that, strategy making and thinking strategically. And so, we really talked about how do you build that capability across the enterprise? So versus it just, sitting in one part of the organization, specifically you're the chief strategy officer, so you're responsible. It's actually a capability that they need in the businesses. And so part of the work we've done together is really looking at kind of what is the plan, what is the process for do that. And I know his boss, the CEO, has said that's kind of one of his expectations for this particular individual.
Yeah, I think that's right, Rob. And I think maybe a hidden secret about people like you and me, we're psychologists, but we're industrial organizational psychologists. And so we've been trained in data analytics from the time we were young, right?
Yep.
And so there's this whole judgment and decision-making process using data around people, which, by the way, tend to be less predictable than anything else you might deal with. But I think in a lot of ways, we think like engineers ourselves. And so we can absolutely relate to what these engineers are going through as they're leading their organizations too. And it really is this cross section between how do you take data to cascade what you need to do for strategic growth, but also then motivate, influence, understand how the people behind those things are going to work, and then break down the barriers so that it becomes more efficient over time. And if you can do that, that's what makes an excellent leader, in my opinion.
Let me continue with that thread. And this is a question to the entire panel, especially because we have a lot of people in technology here. But, we talked early on in the panel just around, the last 12 months and those 15 months and the impact that technology has had. Zoom is the one that comes to mind, but lots of other ones. As technology continues to evolve, what impacts do you see that having on how leaders engage with their teams and lead? Kind of where do you see the interplay moving forward between technology, leadership, human capital? Give you guys a second to think on that.
Rob, I'd love to jump in and
Sure.
It's maybe an anecdote from what Trinetics has been doing with the incessant WebEx and Zoom, et cetera, that we all experienced, just breaking the envelope and doing the things that we heard about of doing cooking together on Zoom. But one specific thing that we've done and that I've kind of taken to heart is just coffee time. Reach out to anyone else in the organization who you do not know and have a coffee with them and talk about anything that's not Trinetics. Talk about fly fishing, talk about food, do something else, just to remind yourself of the humanity that's behind things. We rolled that program out. The original thought was that folks would maybe pick a coffee partner for this month and then they would switch the next month. But what's naturally happened is coffee partners have kind of stuck together. They're in very different departments, to John's earlier point in the panel. And that just builds that synergy where you don't have the water cooler time, et cetera. But even pre-COVID, that was really critical, right? That was happening naturally. And something happened during COVID where folks just forgot to do that. They forgot to make those phone calls that they used to make, or just, have the idle chit chat. It became overly formal somehow. And kind of just using and ignoring the technology in a way to make sure that you're getting to the humanity and able to identify, the people that are struggling, the people that need help, that want to be vulnerable, and that you can then elevate and motivate from there.
Yeah, great.
Steve, I'll add to that. We have something called Content Stack Connect that kind of got started a few weeks ago. And I mean, there's so many of these conversations, and after the conversation that, it's basically someone reaching out to some other person in the organization and setting up a coffee time, and then they talk about other things outside of work, and then they post things on a Slack channel, something about the other person, and it's been awesome to see that sort of connection getting made. And I didn't think of it the way you put it. Like before COVID, we would naturally do that, but because of this, it just became too formal, and that was kind of missing. So that's interesting.
Yeah, just to add on one more thing, I think what we do is, and we started this, about when COVID started, but just, as team, we were very much co-located, right? And that was our model. And people, to your point, Steve, and it's just that people just got together. We open up a Zoom room like this, and teams are on a Zoom call all day long. So they see people coming in and out, they have a coffee, they see the kids running around in the background, right? And it forms and allows just natural conversation around, well, what'd you do this weekend? Or, how are the kids doing? Or, geez, your dog, is going a little crazy. What's going on? Whatever it is, it just allows that interaction. But then it also helps and allows still that ability to mentor or pair or train, if you will, because we're all sitting in a room like this and it's natural. It's become more natural versus, geez, I got to open up and go to another meeting. It's just the way we kind of work, if you will. So just to kind of add on to what everyone else was saying.
Sure, and I'll add to that too. One of the things I've noticed with a couple of clients is the use of collaboration tools like Slack or like Teams, kind of for two things. And I'm really curious, to see kind of how this looks moving forward. But I know that in some places I've worked with, Slack has become kind of the replacement for the water cooler. And so employee interest groups have developed on Slack, wine enthusiasts, golf enthusiasts, hiking, and they have these channels, and it's a way for employees to connect with one another, leveraging this technology, staying more connected. And what I'm really interested to see is kind of what happens, as people start coming back into offices, and does that technology continue to be that source of bringing people together, or is it going to be, will people kind of hybrid between using technology but also kind of wanting the live interaction with folks, which is what I suspect will happen. And then the other thing is, and I'd be interested if any of you have this experience, also using these collaboration tools. It's almost been a catalyst to how can we work more efficiently together as a team. And so one of the things that I work with clients on quite a bit is kind of meeting cadence and, meeting too much and meetings not being productive. Also email, just people bombarded with email, they're at their computers all day in meetings. And so how to use these collaboration tools moving forward to be able to streamline and take advantage of the time that people come together, whether it's on Zoom and eventually kind of live, and using these tools. Any experience in your organizations on either front, kind of leveraging these collaboration tools, and any sense about kind of where you think that goes from here?
I think it's evolving, Rob, to tell you the truth. I think email, to me, it seems like, we had email before, now we have the Slack, the instant communication and the need to respond, or whoever's asking a question, you have to respond. What I do with the folks I work with is kind of just being mindful of who's taking up your time, right? So before the week kind of sets in, and especially in the last 15 months, I think we all look at our calendars and go, oh my God, when am I going to do actual work? So just kind of being mindful of who's taking up that time on your calendar. Also, like you said, like emails, like don't email constantly or ping on Slack constantly and things like that. Just being mindful of asking others, or I wouldn't say like interrupting others, but just shooting off something, and that takes up some work on the other person's side. Like just be mindful of that.
Yeah. So, and I love that point too, because another thing that I often hear is, especially leaders as they transition into new roles, don't necessarily recognize the platform they have. And so when they shoot off that one email, it creates stir, and people are running off, working on things, putting in extra hours, and it's maybe up against an artificial deadline. They're my boss just asked me for this, and so we need to turn this around in the next couple hours. And so one of the things we coach leaders around is kind of recognizing their impact and the impact that it has on others when they fire off that one email or make that one request. I see some nodding heads here, so it looks like that resonates.
I mean, I have a thought on this. It may be unorthodox, but first, I think that when I look at Teams as an example, or Slack, I will not use it after hours. It is one of the most invasive, interruptive technologies I can think of. And so I do not use it after hours. I will use email after hours. To me, email is like a queue or a work list. The second thing I do, which is hard generationally to do because you have a different generation, especially now you're beyond millennials to Gen Edge or Gen Z, which is my daughter's generation. But I try to explain to that generation that you can do get to a lot better decisions a lot faster through dialogue. So I coach this. I used to say, just go walk. I mean, I would walk on the floor all the time. My brother, who's in his late 50s, says that he sits in this cube next to all these people, and they have their headphones on, and they sit across from each other, and they're communicating via Slack. And he's like, just stand up and talk to each other. So I try to emphasize that, not because this is a different generation, but I try to say, look, this can be more efficient, because I explain that what most people are doing is just trying to get their work list cleaned and put it on someone else's plate. So everyone's passing around the hot potato. I'm like, I'm done. Just sitting there with your email, like my inbox is clean. It's now in somebody else's. It just creates self-reinforcing mechanism. And so when dialogue is possible to make decisions and solve problems, use dialogue, because it's just more efficient. Now, I realize that there are a lot of engineers that are going to say, no way, like we don't want to operate that way. And I understand, but it's just even getting an incremental change of when you can have dialogue. And then a third thing is that I think there's censorship, self-censorship on the part of leaders, but I think it's a two-way street. So I think it's incumbent upon the leaders to say, don't just do a task I ask without talking about how important it is, where it sits against your priorities, and how urgent it is. Don't work over the weekend on anything unless someone's explicitly asked you to do it. You come back and find out where the trade-offs are. I talk about every update I have with my teams about prioritization. I told them my number one job, I realized this when I was first a leader back at American Express 20 some years ago. I spend almost every update focused first on prioritization. What are you working on and why? What's important and why? What needs to get done this week? What doesn't? I talk about calendarization. So you put things in the parking lot and don't do it, so you can finish one or two things, get them done, and then move to the next thing. And it's forcing those trade-offs and decisions. And so we as leaders have to teach and coach that behavior. And so I'm not a believer in not emailing. If I'm up working at 1 in the morning, I'm going to email. That does not mean I expect you to respond to my emails. That's just my work. And I think it's actually, I don't know what the word is. It's like almost totalitarian of the person who's like, I don't want to receive emails at midnight. Great, then don't look at your phone. Don't put your phone next to your bed, and don't look at your computer. But that shouldn't stop me from sending an email at midnight just because you're a morning person. I'm a night person. You got to learn to work. And I think it's, there's some of those positions that there's this belief that hey, the person that emails at 1 in the morning is a jerk. I would say, no, the person who doesn't have the discipline to ignore their phone overnight has got to learn to ignore their phone overnight, right? That's right.
Yeah, and I like that, because I think it is a dialogue, right, in terms of just setting expectations about how we operate together. Yeah. So I really like that. And I think the other thing you said that really resonated with me is this, it's the whole boundary. I mean, I think it's become harder and harder, with us being, working from home and things, to set the boundaries of, when does work end, and then putting the phone aside and not kind of being on 24/7. So establishing these boundaries.
The reason I feel Teams and Slack are different is they're completely interruptive mechanisms, and they're built that way. So they're great during the day. And even then, there's a little red button. So then I started to realize, I'm not going to reach out to a person when it's red, right? Yeah. Because that's basically interrupting them in the middle of a conversation. So
in the real world, it's like just barging into their office with the
right. It's closed. It's like just in the middle of a conversation, we're like, sorry, I need you to answer this right now. So.
Right. It's funny how the norms change, right, when you go from the real world to technology. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for that. I want to keep us going, because there's a lot more for us to discuss. And so we're going to jump over to Steve, and we're going to revisit this idea of scale and kind of the challenges that leaders have as they scale, and organizations have as they scale. So Steve, how has Trinetics' success and growth stretched you as a leader in terms of your own personal kind of evolution?
Yeah, it's a great question, and just building on everything we've talked about previously from John and Jason and Corinne, and then the kind of ad hoc dialogue. I can't help but almost be a bobblehead and say everything here I've lived through. So just speaking specifically about the last 6.5, 7-year journey at Trinetics, I was fortunate to join the company. We were about 5 people big, and we all joined within the first month. And we have not become a 5,000 person organization or a 10,000 person organization. Fast forward today, we're about a 200 person organization. So we're not talking about crazy scale, but we effectively grew from a couple of engineers and a dog, is sometimes we say that, a couple engineers and a dog in a garage, to a full-fledged company that was fortunate enough to interact now with the Carlyle Group last fall. And a lot of things transpired there on 2 kind of threads that I'd like to talk about. One is the global thread of just our customer base and our personnel base, and then just on a internal organization growth and how things work there. We set out to be global from day one. One of our initial investors was Novartis, very large pharma. That personnel came in from Europe, building a company based in the United States. And the mantra was, we have to be global from day one because we have to solve Novartis's challenge to better design their clinical trials across the globe. They place them everywhere. So we now operate in 30 countries, and we found ourselves on day one, we had no healthcare organizations that were ready to part with their data. And this is very sensitive information. Where we are asking and going to the world-renowned academic medical centers in the United States, in all the countries in Europe, in APAC, in South America, India, etc. And taking the time to almost super slow down and understand each individual academic medical center. You're going in there talking about very complicated HIPAA, GDPR, security rules, privacy rules, breach notification rules, expert attestations. How are we going to de-identify the data, maintain the sanctity and the privacy, and at the same time, figure out this very complicated business model where we're setting up a barter arrangement, where the healthcare organizations are not being paid by us, and they are purveying the data for us in exchange for matchmaking services with healthcare, with industry. That took a lot of empathy, a lot of time to talk to clinical trial office personnel at HCOs, to get into their chief research information offices, and really just building those relationships, building that trust layer. And that takes a tremendous amount of patience, understanding the different nomenclature, the vocabulary, and then from a technology leader, often boiling down really complicated concepts into something that we can all understand and agree without being condescending, which is an area that, I personally have to work a lot on so that I'm not coming across as condescending because I know this stuff cold. That doesn't matter. You have to figure out a way to work with folks to bridge that gap. So that would be the global aspect. We seem to have been relatively successful now. It's still, every healthcare organization that joins Trinetics, it's the same talk track from a scale perspective. And this kind of moves into the org side of the conversation, is putting in that scaffolding in those systems where myself or the other executive leaders that have been growing through the company, where we always don't have to deliver it. And that is that let go. You have to let go and be confident that the other folks on the team can pick up the ball and run with it. And that's not an easy task when you start off at employee 5, 6, 7, and then you're 20, and then you're 50, and then you're 100. You only had an engineering team. You didn't have a product management team when you started. Then you got a product management team, but you didn't have a data engineering team. But now you have a data engineering team. You had 1 person in sales, now you got 10. You had no one in marketing, now you got 5 people in marketing. And you have to let those functions grow and be confident that they can get their job done. It's something I've struggled with personally, of trusting other departments to get their work done. But when you do it, it's pretty amazing. I'll kind of cap it off lastly, just on the tech side. it's a microcosm there as well, because we start off trying to hire those 10x engineers, those generalizing specialists. We've all heard that term, where you can get the full stack engineer, but you fast forward, and when you have a 100-person engineering organization, you have to now have specialists in infrastructure, in security, in back-end engineering, front-end engineering, middle-tier engineering, and all the time. You don't want to create silos, and it's the same thing on the macro perspective. So those would be some initial thoughts I had there.
Steve, thank you for that. Any of the challenges that you mentioned, I jotted some of them down here: slowing down, letting go. I mean, those are big challenges. Any advice or tips from your own experience about kind of how you were able to kind of move in that direction to be able to do that?
The first word that comes to my mind is patience. I know it's kind of cliche, but I mentioned my passion for fly fishing. You would think I would have a wealth of patience, an unending amount of patience. And it sometimes seems that just when you've run out, just find that other pot of patience, because you get a breakthrough with, the next 24 hours, it happens. And sometimes you run out and you intervene just for the problem to have solved itself 24 hours later. And you kind of go, oh, I should have just waited 24 hours. It's kind of like the last cast in fishing. You haven't caught anything all day, and you always have to say, I'm just going to do one more cast. And my wife would say, yeah, sure, that's like 15 more casts. Having that unending amount of patience. Even my directors of engineering today, we talk about it all the time in our engineering management meetings of be patient, let things play out. When there's a bug in the software, we all know it reduces sometimes to that semicolon that's missing on one line of code. A lot of bugs are really easy. Just be patient, let it come to you. And it's the same thing on the macro scale as well.
Yeah, I think in a world that seems like it's increasingly faster and faster, the ability to be able to do that is a big challenge. And so I appreciate you sharing your experience with that. Awesome. Oh, another thing, as a group, we talked a little bit about, I love the concept of a superpower, or what's your leadership superpower? And so, Nishant, let me ask you that question. What is your leadership superpower, the one leadership skill that brings the most success to how you engage with your teams?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pin down one, but I would go with empathy. Just in my career, I think of myself as a very empathetic person. When I was a young engineer, I thought that trait was like not helping me grow, because I'm thinking too much about the other person or the other company or whatever, But over time, as I started to kind of work with people around the world, having teams around the world, being empathetic, understanding the other side, understanding the person, what gets them going, what are the problems that they have, and spending time with each individual. And time is a valuable resource, right? But as you're building as an entrepreneur, for me, I just want to do like 10 things. And to Steve's point, patience is hard to come by when you're an entrepreneur, because you just want to do like everything. But I feel like, time spent with your team, understanding their side, I think helps you make some really, really interesting and good decisions. And I think, Jason, you made a point. You want to see leaders that have, that bring folks along with them. I've been working in this industry for a long time, and I have, a lot of folks that I've been working for a lot of years across multiple ventures, right? And I would actually put most of that towards, being empathetic, understanding them more than outside of, just work. And then having said that, I'll also bring up, I have a pretty big team in India, currently India is going through some incredible struggles, and we're doing everything we can. Right now, it feels mostly helpless because it's just you can only do so much from here. But I know these folks personally, and so we're trying to do as much as we can. And it's not just it's the teams across, like even in Europe and US. We're all kind of saying majority of our engineering is in India, we're saying, what can we do to help, right? And be empathetic to the situation that's there. We do have all these goals that we want to meet, but currently, we got to kind of be there for each other and do the best we can. So yeah.
I definitely want to talk about that. Just as we're kind of looking at the time a little bit, we want to also give the audience a chance to engage with you all. So for those of you that, and it looks like a message just came up there, have questions, we covered so much good ground here, please put them in the chat box and we will definitely field some of those questions. But Nishant, going back to what you said, well, first and foremost, yes, the situation in India is devastating. And we've heard from several clients just about being able to wanting to engage and to support as much as possible, but feeling a little bit helpless in the situation as well. Now, on the piece of empathy and vulnerability, let me ask, I know earlier on, Jason, we talked a little bit about skills that you're able to develop more easily and skills that are more difficult to develop. What advice would you have to other leaders if you were working with team members who maybe at least you perceive to have lower levels of empathy or having difficulty connecting with folks in the way you talked about? Any advice on your experience or ways that you've coached those leaders to help them, not suddenly overnight become super empathetic, but to connect more with that piece of their leadership style?
I actually have an example, but I don't know. Does anyone else want to go first? So
I guess, well, go ahead. I don't know.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I guess just from my perspective on that, Rob, I think to me, it's almost leading by example. I think Jason, you kind of, talked about it a little bit too of, being in the moment. But I think if other leaders are seeing you act a certain way, showing empathy, building this trust, being vulnerable, shedding a tear once in a while, or whatever the case may be, in doing that across the org or with whoever, and being real about it, right? Where it's not contrite, it's not fake, it's true emotion and it's true empathy. And I think what I've seen is if leaders and more people in the org are leading and showing that, it seems like others tend to pick up on it, but it's kind of a hard trade. So that's just one thing that I'd throw out.
Mm-hmm. Yep. The idea of leading by example. And I do think cultures are developed by role models in the organization. And so even if it doesn't come so naturally, when you see kind of it resonates, I think that becomes easier to help people with. Jason, let's hear your story.
I mean, first of all, I think like emotional intelligence, obviously, like it is, some people are more naturally empathetic than others. And I do think one of the things I like to teach is tolerance for personality differences. And like, there was a saying in American Express, assume positive intent, understanding what's behind people's motives. I really do think where personality and style-based assessments are valuable is actually post-employment, to understand others on your teams and why certain people talk a lot and others don't, and how you then manage those people. But I have the best example I have, and it's very hard to teach, but I have one place where I've been successful. And it was where I had an unempathetic direct report who was basically abusing my time. And what I tell people to, and I usually put it on the shoes of the person who is on the short end of the stick, empathy-wise, to communicate to the person who's not being empathetic how their actions are impacting them. And so I had this individual, and I basically explained the impact on me and my life and my psychology that some of their behavior was having in terms of, their selfishness with, how they treated our time. And it was hard to give this feedback because I am chronically late, and it's a terrible trait. So I have to start by saying, I realize like I'm not the best at this, but I want to give you these examples. And I also had an individual reporting to the same person. And I said, I have to coach them. But to me, the best way to do it is to get the individuals impacted to actually step up and voice it. Because most people don't want to be unempathetic. They just aren't self-aware that it's happening. And so to me, that's because coaching your team, saying be more empathetic doesn't work. You have to have someone convey this to you. And what's funny is I learned this from my boss. because I am not, my empathy EQ score is not great, but my boss said I was the most empathetic direct report he had. I was the only one that understood that he, as CEO, had a very lonely job, and that, you know, he was between us and his board, and that he felt like I was the one person who understood that. And I had thought about that. I'm like, God, I never thought about like upward empathy. And it transformed a lot how I thought. So he taught me that. So anyway, I just think that the only way to do it is to get the people who are impacted to share how it's actually impacting them. This is how it's impacting me. That way it's not a personal attack. And most people are motivated to eliminate that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah,
Rob,
I love, go ahead.
sorry. Yeah.
No, please.
You know, we talk about high performing teams and what high performing teams do. And one of the key things, to your point, Jason, that high performing teams do is give each other feedback, and they don't wait for the leader to do it. They actually exchange that information with one another in a caring way. But they're open, they're honest, they have trust, they have psychological safety, they're willing to continuously improve together by offering that feedback. And I think that's a tough thing for people to do. In fact, I think sometimes Rob and I get thrown in as coaches because the bosses or the others don't want to deliver the feedback, which is not a good reason, by the way, to invest in a coach. That is, we have higher and better value than that sometimes. But I do think it's important to share that feedback, and people who are conflict avoidant or who don't have the emotional intelligence have a tough time with that. Something else that you said that kind of piqued my interest that I thought was interesting was, you know, there's this element too of inclusive leadership. And how do you include people who are different from you? And Nishan, I think you hit on this too, this idea of, hey, not everybody has the same personality type, not everybody comes from the same country, not everybody's going through the same experience. How do we rise as leaders to being more than just being aware of needing to include others, to actually moving towards advocacy of including others? How do we make sure that, to John's point, we set that role in the organization and stage our cultures to be inclusive? Because inclusion, we know, also delivers, by the way, better judgment, decision-making, and strategy. So I think those are really interesting things that you're speaking about when you're talking about empathy, as well as, you know, really being the better leader at the enterprise level for the organization.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Hey, Nishan, I want to continue with you. Just kind of another question I think is, you know, particularly relevant to you. When you think about leading an organization through technological advancements, what are some of the challenges that you find organizations face from a leadership perspective? We've talked, technology always has been the theme of this whole conversation today, and kind of beginning to look forward. Any advice to folks around how to lead an organization through technology advancement?
Yeah, that's. I think it all depends on what stage you are in the company. So when you're kind of starting out, you're moving pretty fast. You're trying to get the product market fit. You know, you're up to speed. Like, you have a small team. You're just trying a bunch of things, right? And quickly iterating. I think as you scale, kind of go from a startup to a scale side, and there's a lot of challenges. You know, one aspect of that is technology. Is how do you keep that agility that you had when you were in that startup mode, when in that scaling mode, right? And you know, we're going through that right now, and it's like the top thing that I'm dealing with. The way I'm trying to do is kind of split the teams up, have that sort of experimental kind of team on the side, to keep just trying and be okay with failing, and you know, just try new ideas. Don't even think about sort of the business outcome, because I don't want to get rid of that thinking that we had when we were a startup, because I think that's what kind of keeps us, you know, at the forefront of technology. So we're trying to balance that with, you know, having a lot of customers and having a lot of scale. We want to continually advance there as well, and then all the things that we had done in the startup mode kind of, you know, becomes tech debt. So how do you manage that, right? And then the core piece of tech that you built that actually got the product market fit, how do you keep that going and adding new features and things like that? So those are kind of like three buckets that, you know, I think about, and it's a constant process of making sure that we're not slowing down, right? We want to keep that velocity going. So yeah, that's how I think about it. I have like an incubation, of, 2 or 3 incubation teams, and it's just like 1 or 2 or 3 folks in there. They're just trying things, experimental. Hey, can we try this out? Just to see how it goes, and it's okay to fail and this and that. There's also, tech debt. Like, when do we have to revisit that technology that we built, and when is it, not serving the purpose that it was built for? So kind of making some decisions on that, and kind of spending some time, and make, you don't want to fix all the tech that's out there. It's, you want to fix the ones that you think is going to be problematic with scale. You don't just replace something just because there's a newer or cooler technology out there. If it works, it works, right? So those are those decisions. And then the core tech or the core product that got you the product market fit, how do you keep that going, the feature set? So we set up separate teams that are just constantly iterating over new features and making sure that we're delivering for the customers that we're bringing on board. So those are kind of the ways I'm dealing with it now, because this is kind of the growth phase. Yeah. So. Awesome.
Yeah. One of the words you used kind of early on in your answer there was agility. And that means a lot of different things. And so we're actually going to we started getting some questions from the audience. And so I'm going to throw these questions out to all of you, and just get kind of your thoughts. As we're kind of coming to the end of this, the idea of this panel is to really talk about kind of leadership traits that really stick out. And so this person asked, we hear a lot about learning agility as a predictor of success. As you build your teams, is that one of the traits high on your list of priorities? And if so, kind of how do you assess for that?
Hey, since no one's speaking, I will. So learning agility, I read that to mean cognitive learning ability, which is really ability to process and synthesize information under time pressure, and make correct decisions. We actually use pre-hire assessments as a key element in our process. It's one part of the process, and those pre-hire assessments all come with the cognitive learning assessment component, and so it is a factor in our process, and we definitely use it to understand that. The threshold is fairly reasonable. One of the mistakes people make is that they think, what all the evidence shows that once you're over a certain threshold, it doesn't matter how far you're over that threshold. Mm-hmm. All that matters is that you have an adequate level of cognitive learning ability in order to perform an executive management role. There's no correlation once you're above a certain level. So there's really like a line of demarcation above which probability of success is materially higher than below, and it's probabilistic. So you can score below the line and be successful, and you can score above the line and not be successful, which is why it's one component of an overall assessment process.
I would add to what, and Steve, I see you want to talk too. I would add to that. I think it's learning and agility, and we put those two things together. But learning is that cognitive space that you're talking about that we can assess in a talent assessment or as we're bringing people on board. The agility piece is about curiosity in my mind. It's about wanting to understand things differently than you understand them today. And I think there are a variety of ways you can look for that in someone as you hire them, either through an interview process, through the experiences that you were talking about, Jason. And if you've used upfront assessment, like batteries, you can certainly do it that way. That's the way Summit does it. But, I think it's slightly different things. There's sort of cognitive horsepower. Are you intellectually able to make the decisions and analyze the data and that kind of thing? And then there's this piece that's more about, do you want to see different perspectives? Do you want to test out new things? Do you want to be creative? And it's those two things together that I think equate to the learning agility that you're referring to, Rob, in my opinion.
Steve.
I strongly agree with what Corinne just mentioned. Just pointing to the agility. Another word I would use there is desire. Some folks express that desire innately. And you talk about carving off 20% of your time to do other things, or make sure you plan into your daily work that for 20% of your time or 10% of your time, you're going to be doing something else. And that puts a lot of power into people's hands, but very few people take advantage of it sometimes. And they'll fill up their plate and not be cognizant of their time management to keep that 10 or 20% safe. Even though myself or folks that work with me, we exude that all the time and say, do this. We literally want you to plan this in. Some folks don't do that. Some folks do it naturally, and you can see that and measure it. For those that don't, but have the innate ability, that's where you can come in as that servant leader, that coach, and encourage them and say, hey, why aren't you carving that time out? I know you talk about this outside, but carve that time out, right? We can exchange our deadlines and we're in control here. Read that extra paper or go to that extra conference or go to that customer meeting, even though you usually avoid that because you're not a required attendee. Do it anyway. And that's where you're going to learn. So I would just amplify that desire.
Yeah, I think everything you said, Steve, we experience the same thing, right? That we encourage it. We, say, hey, carve out some allocation of every sprint to learning new things, right? Some people take advantage of it, some don't. I mean, the only other thing to add from my perspective is we've actually put in place some things to help people, right? Hackathons every quarter or every, couple times a year, right? To get people thinking and learning and doing something different and collaborating with others and getting feedback real time and then you can see too, that helps assess who's taking part of that, who's really engaged in that, who's leading that. And you kind of can see and recognize who some of those high performers are that willing and are able to have that learning agility, if you will. So that's one other thing that we do as well.
I think one thing I would say to that is there's also this aspect of unlearning what you have, right? What you have learned. And I'll give you an example. When I started as a software engineer, it was pre-cloud, a few years before the cloud. And there's a certain sort of pattern and process that we followed in those days. And that was just kind of ingrained in my head. And we've built a few cloud products, but now in terms of scale, I heard someone else talk about, hey, we don't need QA in order to move fast. And when I first heard it, I was like, oh, this is just nuts. Like, how can you do this without it, right? And that was like a process of unlearning that I had to go through and just kind of understand it. And you still, like, we're trying to get agility. We want to increase our velocity of release. And this kind of ties back to the ownership aspect of it as well. Like, if you enable your team to be empowered with making decisions to go all the way to prod, like your developers, there's a different way to think about it, right? And so that's like unlearning. Like, I had to unlearn what I had learned to try this new thing in this new world. So there's that aspect of it as well. So
I love it. I love that. We hear so much about learning, and obviously learning is really, really important, right? But the ability to unlearn things, I'd almost say is, in some level, more challenging than learning in some cases. And that's a great example. And I think just kind of where we are as a society right now, we are going through a process of unlearning things as we continue to evolve and change. And so that is a great skill to have. Great. Well, let's field at least one or two more questions. I'm kind of looking at the time here. And so we have some questions coming in. So this one's a long one, so let me bear with me as I get through it. But do you think work from home, work from anywhere is here to stay? And how can companies and tech leaders create a coherent winning culture if the team doesn't spend much time together in real life? So it kind of revisits the question of culture that we kind of touched on a little bit as we went through this. So kind of where are we going with this? And you as leaders, and I think John touched on it a little bit as well. What does that look like in terms of developing culture with maybe mixed populations, some in the office, some at home? How you guys are thinking about that? John, you mentioned co-location at some point, pre-pandemic, it was all about co-location.
Yeah, I mean, I think my opinion is, remote work, right? Distributed teams, maybe hybrid teams are here to stay, right? I think our philosophy prior to COVID was we very much felt co-location was more efficient, more effective, and all of that, though we had some distributed teams. With COVID, right, everybody working remotely, we realized, shit, we can be as effective, if not maybe more effective sometimes, in a distributed model and remote model. But what I'm hearing too from teams is they really do crave some level of getting together, right? Physically seeing each other, shaking somebody's hand. We have team meetings with my staff and we'll debate like hell. Rob, you've seen it, right? And what we chuckle now is when we used to do it, we then go out for beers afterwards and dinner, right? And all hug and feel better about ourselves. Now it's a bit harder. So I think it's a constant, I think, focus that we all have to build that culture. If we are going to be remote, how do we, get that personal touch, that empathy that Nishant talked about. I mean, all those things, it's harder, but I think that's where our leaders need to evolve to make sure that they maybe are taking more time than they have in the past to reach out to people, to build that culture, however that may be, in a remote way.
I think the example you just gave there around kind of how you think about kind of remote is an example of unlearning, right?
Mm-hmm. Right,
this whole way of
exactly.
An example of unlearning.
It is, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Other thoughts, yeah, Steve?
Rob, I'd just like to throw out maybe a very tactile dimension of kind of working rules that will have always been and I think will be continued important as we have this heterogeneity in the working environment, whether it's in the office or virtual. And what I mean by the work rules is, if you were a manager that was a button chairs type of person where you walked around the office, and if the employee was there from 7 in the morning until 6 at night, and you thought that meant productivity, that's never meant productivity to me personally. And when talking to managers or directors or engineers, it's always been talking about, we're not running a kindergarten. We're not running a daycare. We're adults. We trust you to get your job done. And that was pre-COVID. And that was without requiring co-location. And we were already working as remote teams. We can't forget that as we start to come back from post-pandemic. And sometimes the empathy that John was talking about of doing the coffee talk and doing that type of work gets overshadowed by, hey, why didn't Steve respond to my email at 9:30? Does that mean he's off gallivanting in his backyard mowing his lawn and not doing his job? Those types of things need to not enter into the ethos, and they're hard to keep out as well.
Let me just ask, I'm looking at time about 4 minutes left here. Any just closing thoughts when you think about kind of the 5 traits, and we've talked a lot more than 5 traits today. As you guys look to the future and think about what leadership needs to evolve to, or is evolving to. Any final thoughts? Anyone want to share a final thought around what that looks like moving forward?
I don't think it needs to evolve at all. I think it's always been the same forever.
Right.
Leaders have certain characteristics. We talked about empathy. We talked about judgment. I think there's an element of structure and, able to use mechanisms, structure and data to, help influence and drive behavior. I think, I don't think it changed. I think it was the same in 80 to 1000 as it is today, to be honest with you.
That's a great thought. I think that's a great thought to close on. So first and foremost, we want to thank all the panelists. I always share with my colleagues, I think we learn as much from our clients as they learn from us. And so it's a very mutually, strong relationship. So thank you for taking time. So I think there were some really, really good insights. I know one of the things we're going to do after this is go back and watch, as I know team members here who've been on as well, kind of taking notes. We really want to distill. I think there was a lot of wisdom that was shared during this panel discussion. And we want to distill that down. And for the folks of you out there, thank you for joining us today. We are going to reflect back, a lot of the learnings that we had today as part of this panel conversation. And so with that, thank you everybody for joining us. On behalf of Summit, on behalf of Corinne and the rest of us here, we look forward to partnering with you. And as you can see, we have great clients here who we've learned a lot from and can continue to learn from. So thank you so much and have a good rest of your days.
Thanks, Bob.